Emily Carter woke up that morning with the same dull heaviness she had felt for months. It had become normal for her to open her eyes and sense emptiness in the room even though she was still married and still living in the same house she had shared with Daniel for 8 years. Their marriage had once been full of small joys, shared breakfasts, late-night talks, and weekend trips, but now it felt like a quiet house with two shadows moving around each other without warmth. She stood up slowly, trying to brush off the sadness that tried to cling to her every day, and went straight to the kitchen expecting the same familiar silence. But that morning was different in a way she didn't see coming. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard sounds, light sounds at first, like someone opening a cupboard or shifting something on the counter. Her heart jumped because she was sure she had locked the doors, and Daniel had left early for work as always. She moved carefully, worried but also confused. The last thing she expected was company, especially at this hour. She reached the doorway, and instead of the empty kitchen she always saw, she found a man standing with his back toward her, sorting through a grocery bag on her counter. The man turned when he heard her gasp. It was Marcus Reed, her neighbor, a kind, calm black man in his mid-30s whom she had met a few months earlier at a community event. Marcus lived 2 houses down, and he had always shown a gentle kind of friendliness, the kind that didn't push into anyone's space but made people feel safe. Emily never forgot the warmth in his smile the first time they met, but she never expected him in her kitchen like this. He lifted both hands slightly in an apologetic way and gave a small laugh. "I'm sorry if I scared you," he said. "Your door was unlocked and I knocked, but no one answered. I brought you some groceries. You mentioned you were running low last night." Emily blinked hard, her mind trying to catch up. She had talked to him briefly the day before when she ran into him at the mailbox. She had looked tired, overwhelmed, and he had asked if she was eating well. She had laughed it off, but she must have looked worse than she realized because he actually remembered, actually cared. Something inside her softened, something she didn't expect to feel first thing in the morning. Marcus's presence filled the quiet kitchen in a gentle way. He wasn't loud, he wasn't awkward, he simply stood there holding a bag with basic groceries, milk, bread, fruit, things she had been too exhausted to buy. She tried to smile, but the weight she carried made her expression tremble. He noticed instantly, and his warm eyes softened even more. "You okay?" he asked quietly, and those 2 words hit her harder than they should have, because no one had asked her that with real concern in a long time. She wanted to say yes, to pretend, to give a polite answer, but her eyes fell on the counter where her phone started buzzing. It was Daniel again, sending another cold text saying he had to stay late at work. Again, no checking in, no greeting, no emotion, just a string of excuses that felt like a wall being built between them every day. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and Marcus saw the shift in her face. The way her eyes darkened with hurt she didn't hide fast enough. He didn't ask more questions. He simply placed the grocery bag gently on the counter and stepped aside as though giving her space to breathe. That tiny act of respect did something to her heart, something quiet but powerful. Emily realized she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, actually seen, not as a responsibility or an obligation, but as a person with feelings that mattered. She tried to thank him, but the words caught, mixed with exhaustion and confusion. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, and he shook his head with a small smile. "Sometimes people need a reminder that they're not invisible," he said, and it surprised her how much those words tugged at her chest. For a moment the kitchen felt different, warmer, calmer, as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for too long. She looked at Marcus, at the kindness in his eyes, at the quiet strength he carried, and she felt a strange pull inside her, not romantic, not dramatic, but a gentle longing for something she didn't even know how to name, something like comfort, connection, or maybe the hope of finally being understood. She leaned against the counter, trying to regain balance, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't want to face. Why had she grown so distant from her own husband? When had she stopped feeling loved? Why did a simple gesture from a neighbor make her chest feel warm in a way she didn't remember feeling for years? Marcus took a step back as if giving her more space, proving once again that he understood emotions without needing to talk about them. He glanced at the groceries and then at her again. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said softly. "I can go if you want." Part of her wanted him to stay because his presence made the morning feel less heavy, but another part of her feared the comfort he brought because it highlighted how cold her marriage had become. She shook her head quickly. "No, it's okay," she said. "I'm just not used to surprises." He nodded, his voice calm. "Good surprises are rare, but they're important." That sentence lingered in her mind longer than she expected. Marcus moved toward the door, but before leaving, he paused and looked at her with a quiet certainty. "If you ever need help or if you want someone to talk to, I'm close by," he said. "You don't have to go through everything alone." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the house quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the lonely silence she had grown used to, but a thoughtful one. A silence filled with questions she wasn't ready to answer and emotions she didn't want to name yet. She sank into a chair and stared at the groceries on the counter, realizing that the smallest act of kindness from someone who barely knew her felt more comforting than anything Daniel had done for months. She didn't know what to do with that truth, so she simply sat there, letting the morning unfold around her, letting her heart feel things it had pushed deep down, letting her mind travel through memories of how her marriage had shifted from love to distance without her noticing until it was too late. She thought about Marcus, about the timing of his arrival, about how life sometimes sends people when you're quietly falling apart and don't even say it out loud. Emily wondered if this morning meant something, or if it was just a rare moment of kindness in a season of loneliness. She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing clearly. The moment she saw him in her kitchen, her heart reacted, her mind shook awake, and something inside her whispered that maybe the universe was trying to show her something she wasn't brave enough to face yet. But the truth stayed with her all day, quiet but undeniable. That morning was the first time in months she didn't feel completely alone, and she wasn't ready to forget that feeling. The weeks after that surprising morning in the kitchen felt different for Emily. She didn't plan it and she didn't try to make anything happen, but life kept putting Marcus in her path in ways she couldn't ignore. It started with small moments, a wave from across the street, a short conversation near the mailboxes, a friendly check-in when she came home late from work looking tired. Everything happened naturally, but each moment pulled her out of a sadness she had been drowning in for too long. Her marriage to Daniel had reached a place she no longer knew how to repair. He wasn't cruel, but he was distant, distracted, and disconnected. Every day he came home later than before, every night he sat on his phone or computer, and their conversations had become short and practical, nothing more. Emily still tried to pretend things were fine, but even she could feel the truth slipping through her fingers like cold water. Marcus, without meaning to, became the one person who noticed what she tried to hide. He always looked at her with a quiet understanding, as if he sensed the heaviness she carried. He never asked questions she didn't want to answer, never pushed into her personal life, but his presence made her feel seen, and that feeling became a soft, warm place her heart kept returning to, even when she didn't want to admit it. One evening after a long day at work, Emily sat on her porch with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The sky was cloudy and the wind carried the scent of rain. She was thinking about her marriage again, trying to understand when everything started falling apart. When she heard footsteps approaching, when she looked up, she saw Marcus walking toward her with a gentle smile. "You look like you've had a long day," he said in a calm voice. She nodded, unable to hide the exhaustion anymore. He didn't ask what happened, he didn't need to. He simply sat on the porch steps beside her and waited for her to talk if she wanted to. That simple silence felt safer than any conversation she had shared with Daniel in months. After a few minutes she finally spoke. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing in my own home," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know when things changed, but they did." Marcus listened without interrupting. His eyes held a softness that made it easy for her to speak. She told him how Daniel stayed out late almost every day, how he seemed to care more about work than their marriage, how their life felt like two strangers living under the same roof. She didn't go into deep detail, she didn't speak badly about her husband, she only shared the hurt she carried. When she finished, Marcus said quietly, "You don't deserve to feel alone when you're not alone." The words hit her straight in the chest, not because they were romantic, but because they were honest. She had been trying so hard to ignore the loneliness that she forgot what it felt like to hear genuine concern from someone. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Marcus stood up and gently offered his hand. "Come inside before you catch a cold," he said. She hesitated, unsure if she should, but something in his voice, calm, steady, caring, made her follow. His home was warm, cozy, filled with soft lighting and the faint smell of coffee. It felt peaceful in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. They sat on his couch, and the sound of rain hitting the windows created a rhythm that made the moment feel strangely intimate. Not romantic, but emotionally close. Emily found herself telling him more than she expected. Not secrets, but feelings, things she had kept bottled inside. Things she couldn't tell her husband anymore because he never listened. Marcus didn't judge her, didn't take sides, he simply listened with respect, and she felt lighter with every word she spoke. At one point she looked at him and asked softly, "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." He held her gaze for a moment before answering. "Sometimes you don't need years to understand someone," he said. "Sometimes you see pain in a person's eyes and you don't want them to carry it alone." His honesty made her heart tighten, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that reminded her she wasn't as numb as she thought. She was still capable of feeling, of wanting comfort, of wanting someone to understand her. But she knew she had to be careful. She didn't want to hurt anyone, not Marcus, not herself, and not Daniel, even though their relationship was falling apart. Before she could respond, his phone rang. The sound broke the moment instantly, pulling both of them back into reality. He answered with a quick apology and stepped aside to talk. His voice was low and calm, but she could tell the conversation wasn't casual. She couldn't hear the words, but his expression grew thoughtful, maybe even conflicted. When he returned, the mood had shifted. There was something in his eyes, something heavy, maybe worry or hesitation. He sat down again but kept a respectful distance. "Emily," he said slowly, "I think we need to be careful with whatever this is." Her heart stopped for a second, not because he said something wrong, but because he said something true. He continued, "I care about you, but I don't want to be the reason things get harder for you." She felt her breath catch. She wasn't angry, she wasn't hurt, but she was scared because she realized she had been leaning on him more than she intended, and she wasn't sure how to stop. "I didn't mean for this to become complicated," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not complicated," he said kindly. "It's human." The rain outside grew louder, echoing the storm inside her. She stood up, feeling overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't control, and he walked her to the door, not rushing her, not pushing her away, just giving her room to think. Before she stepped into the rain, he said softly, "We should talk, but maybe not tonight. You need time, and I don't want to say something that makes things worse." She nodded slowly, grateful for his maturity, grateful for his patience, and at the same time terrified of how deeply she already trusted him. The walk home felt long and confusing. Every drop of rain felt like a whisper reminding her that her heart was drifting towards something she wasn't supposed to feel. She didn't want to cross any lines. She didn't want to betray herself or anyone else, but she couldn't deny the truth either. Something inside her had woken up, something that had been silent for too long. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm outside, replaying every word Marcus had said, replaying the tenderness in his eyes, replaying the fear she felt when she realized how important he had already become in her life. Even though nothing improper had happened between them, the emotional closeness scared her more than anything. She knew she had to make a choice soon. A choice that would define not only her marriage but her own identity. She needed to face truths she had avoided for years, truths about love, loneliness, and the quiet ways a heart can drift when it's starving for comfort. And as she closed her eyes that night, one thought kept echoing through her mind, a thought she didn't want to admit out loud yet. She wasn't afraid of what she felt for Marcus, she was afraid of how real it felt. The moment everything finally broke open came on a Sunday morning that felt too quiet. Emily woke up with a strange heaviness in her chest, the kind that told her something was about to change. She walked downstairs expecting the usual silence, but instead she found Daniel standing in the living room. He had come home early after disappearing for 2 days with nothing but short texts and empty promises. His eyes looked tired, his shirt wrinkled, and for a moment she almost hoped he would say something honest, something real, something that could save what was left of their marriage, but all he said was, "I'm heading out again later." As if that was normal, as if she should accept it without question. Emily stared at him, realizing that she no longer recognized the man she had married. The distance between them had grown too wide, and no amount of pretending could close it anymore. She asked gently, "Daniel, can we talk?" He sighed, the kind of sigh people give when they're already done with a conversation they haven't even started. "Not now," he muttered. "I'm tired." That was the moment something inside her cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a thread finally snapping after holding too much weight for too long. She didn't cry, she didn't argue. She simply felt herself finally wake up from a long emotional sleep. Later that afternoon, while Daniel was showering, Emily stood in their bedroom, staring at the life she had tried so hard to keep together, the wedding photos, the neatly arranged ties, the worn-out calendar with canceled dates and broken promises. She realized she had been holding on to memories, not reality, and she knew she could no longer stay in a marriage that no longer had a heartbeat. With trembling hands, She packed a small bag. Not to run away, not to hide, but because she needed space to breathe. She wrote a short note for Daniel, not blaming him, not accusing him, just stating the truth. We need to talk, we can't keep living like roommates who avoid each other. I'm staying with a friend tonight so we can think clearly. She didn't mention Marcus because this decision wasn't about another man, it was about herself, her pain, her loneliness, her need to rediscover who she was before everything fell apart. Emily walked to Marcus's house slowly, not because she wasn't sure, but because the weight of what she had just done made her feel fragile. When she reached his door, she almost turned back, not wanting to place her burdens on him, but when he opened the door and saw her standing there, exhausted and shaken, his expression changed instantly from surprise to concern. You look like you've made a decision, he said gently. She nodded, trying to steady her breath. I have, but it's not what you think. He stepped aside so she could enter, and she walked in with slow steps, feeling the warmth of his home wrap around her like a blanket she didn't know she needed. She sat on his couch, hands trembling, trying to string her thoughts together. Then she told him everything, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with quiet truth. I'm ending my marriage, not because of you, not because of anything that happened between us. I'm ending it because I've been lost for a long time, and I don't recognize myself anymore. Marcus listened with full attention, his eyes steady, his breathing calm. When she finished speaking, a long silence filled the room, a silence that carried understanding, not judgment. He finally spoke, his voice low and sincere. Emily, I don't want to be the reason you walk away from something, but I can be someone who stands beside you while you rebuild yourself. His response surprised her, not because of the words, but because of the patience in them. He didn't try to pull her closer, didn't try to make her feel obligated. He simply offered support without expectation, and that made her eyes fill with tears she had been holding back for weeks. The next few weeks were a storm of emotions. Daniel reacted with confusion, frustration, and then cold acceptance when she told him she wanted a separation. They talked, not with shouting but with painful honesty, and both of them realized that they had been growing apart long before Marcus ever entered Emily's life. Ending their marriage wasn't easy, it was heartbreaking, it was exhausting. It was filled with paperwork, memories, and long conversations late at night that made Emily cry until she had no tears left. But it was also freeing because for the first time in years, she was choosing herself, choosing her peace, choosing her emotional survival. During that time, Marcus kept his distance in the most respectful way. He didn't show up uninvited, didn't message her too much, didn't cross emotional lines, but whenever she needed someone to talk to, whenever she felt overwhelmed or scared, he was there, not as a replacement for her husband, but as a steady presence reminding her that she wasn't alone. When the separation was finally settled, the house felt too quiet, too empty, too full of memories that were both heavy and fading at the same time. Emily moved into a small apartment a few blocks away from her old home. She filled it with soft lights, simple furniture, and the kind of quiet that didn't hurt but healed. One evening, a few weeks after the documents were finalized, Emily sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the Seattle sky in shades of orange and gold. She felt calm, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't rushing to rebuild her life. She wasn't rushing to fill the empty spaces. She was simply learning how to breathe again. Then she saw Marcus walking down the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, lost in his thoughts. He noticed her and gave a small smile, not assuming anything, not expecting anything, just acknowledging her presence with warmth. She stood up slowly, feeling a soft flutter of something she didn't want to push away anymore. When he reached her porch, she looked into his eyes and said quietly, "For the first time in a long time, I feel like myself again." He stepped a little closer, giving her space to move or step back. "And for the first time," he said softly, "you're choosing a future that belongs to you." Something in those words settled deep inside her, not as a promise of romance, not as a spark of something dramatic, but as a beginning, a gentle, steady beginning she didn't need to rush into. The wind brushed past them, carrying the scent of blooming trees and the soft hum of the evening. Emily felt the warmth of hope rising inside her, not tied to a man, not tied to a relationship, but tied to her own healing. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know where her story with Marcus would go. She didn't know how long it would take for her heart to fully trust again. But she knew something important, something simple, something clear. Her new life began the moment a kind man surprised her in her kitchen and reminded her that she wasn't invisible, that she was allowed to feel, allowed to heal, allowed to choose herself. The future was open now, and for the first time, Emily wasn't afraid to walk into it.